But let's start out with Symeon himself. In a way, we could call him a poster child for deification. And I'll come to that in a moment. But first, it's perhaps best to provide his setting, the time and place of his life, going by Ireneo Serre's chronology, and I don't know anything better than that. He's born around 949 AD and dies in, 1021, which makes his life roughly contemporary with that of the great medieval Byzantine emperor Basil II, the Bulgar slayer, under whose reign the old empire achieved its medieval peak, whence it was a long downhill run to extinction. 4 centuries that took. But in his day, the empire was an unquestioned fact of life, so unquestioned as to be fundamental. It spanned a region from Sicily to almost the Caspian Sea, from the upper reaches of modern-day Croatia to the coasts of Lebanon. It had been prosecuting a series of successful reconquistas for the 200 years preceding, or almost 200 years preceding. And it arrived at a measure of self-confidence, one might even say complacency, that was very much part of Symeon's atmosphere and to which he reacted, because this had an ecclesiastical equivalent in a church establishment which was likewise celebrating triumphs, notably the recently successful, happened in Symeon's own lifetime, conversion of Kievan Rus. And together with this complacency, I would call it, you had a kind of conservative rigidity, an attitude. And remember, this is also during the modest Byzantine Renaissance begun by people like Michael Psellos, also a contemporary of Symeon. A fascination with the classical roots of the Greek tradition, but together with that, a kind of insistence that the past was the measure of all things, and no one could aspire to that genius in the present day, including, and this included matters ecclesiastical and religious. The apostles were once for all, which of course in one sense was true. They were historical individuals, and nothing like that would precisely happen again, but likewise their experience of Christ was consigned to the deep past. And Symeon arrives as a kind of loud objection to that state of affairs. I said a poster child for deification because that was his whole message. Together with the insistence that it was not something reserved for the distant past or the eschatological future, but rather it was possible, and indeed it was necessary. He might have overemphasized that angle. It was necessary and possible now. In this regard, of course, he was, as we'll see, he was saying nothing but in a new way. Because he accompanied this with this insistence with the parallel insistence that he had seen it and known it. This was the new bit. In all preceding patristic literature that I'm aware of, I've only come across the use of the first person singular for the vision of God twice, in addition to Symeon. The Macarian homonist does it once in the 8th homily of the collection of 50, and we'll come to him eventually. And Aphrahat, the Persian sage, whom certainly no one in Constantinople had ever heard of, well, no one else actually either until nearly the turn of the 20th century, save the Armenians, who troubled to translate him, once. Symeon doesn't just do it once, he does it regularly. Perhaps most especially in his hymns, but most everywhere else. And that was new and shocking. In fact, his sobriquet, New Theologian, probably comes from that fact. And it wasn't intended originally as a compliment. Those of you who've done Byzantine theology will know that new was not a good thing, especially when you're coming to doctrine. Actually, the subtext was heretic. Now, his followers, he didn't just have detractors, he had followers, took it up, said, yeah. Because, of course, the second part, theologian, was a very rare accolade. In present Orthodox usage, there are exactly 3 people who have that title. The 4th evangelist, Gregory Nazianzus, and Symeon. So it means someone who is speaking from a particularly deep well, as it were, of experience. So his followers gladly took up the title in order to present Symeon as one who speaks with the same authority as the ancients of the things of God and from his own experience. Symeon himself was sensitive to the accusations that he was saying something untraditional, and argues in one passage, Catechesis 34, if we have views different from the apostles and the holy God-inspired fathers, if we fail to repeat what the Holy Gospels say about God, then let us be anathema. Instead, however, he insists, we restore the teachings of the Master and the apostles that some have perverted. The last remark was probably directed to a few individuals of whom at least one of whom we know the name. And much of his work is concerned with arguments with these people, especially in the ethical discourses, but not missing elsewhere. But the purpose of my talk is to say, well, he's right. He was saying things that were perfectly within the tradition and consonant with the apostles, and indeed now I come to my hobby horse, with the revelation to Israel. And that's where we'll move next. That the roots of his teaching, and indeed of the New Testament witness, lie in the revelation to Israel, especially the theophanic tradition that we find notably in the book of Exodus, in the 6th chapter of Isaiah, in the 1st chapter of Ezekiel, and the Psalms throughout. And where the important word, at least the one that I'll be focusing on, is the Hebrew word kavod. Literally, it has to do with weight or heaviness. But it is definitely the priestly sources, to use the language of Wellhausen, which in this instance, he might be actually right about schools. Not something I'll say about E and J, but about P, yeah. It's the word of choice for God's appearance in Exodus, say, where it is the kavod, which is usually rendered glory in the English translation, that descends upon Sinai, wrapped in fire and smoke in the cloud, which Moses speaks to in Exodus 24 following, and again in 33-34, which he asks to see, show me your glory, after the colloquy following the episode of the golden calf, where God is ticked off and says, I've had it with his lot. Let's start over, you and me. And like Abraham over Sodom, Moses talks him down, and then asks the favor of seeing the glory. And you might recall the episode with the cleft in the rock and making this glory pass, and Moses seeing the back parts. And that pericope, by the way, which appears in 2 rather telling moments in the church year, Friday, Great Friday Vespers, and the eve of the Transfiguration, not accidentally in either case. And then finally, Moses descending from the mountain with shining face to frighten the Israelites. But he's reflecting the kavod, the glory. And the second is the verse from Genesis 1:26, God making human beings in his image and likeness. And to elucidate the connection, I will do something methodologically impossible for a historian. I'll refer you to a 6th century, early 7th century Syriac writer, Jacob of Sarug, who wrote an enormous homily that was my Syriac homework for about a year on the chariot that Ezekiel the prophet saw. Now, this enormous thing, which is about 1,300 lines, I can tell you from bitter experience, I counted them all. This whole enormous thing revolves around 3 texts. Genesis 1:26 that I just cited. Ezekiel, well, that makes, maybe we'll say 4. Ezekiel 1:26 and 1:28. And Philippians 2, or is it 9 or 5? I can't remember which. The self-emptying of Christ. He who was in the form of God emptied himself, took the form of a servant. Now, it happened in the translation that Jacob had, the Peshitta, that the Pauline verse renders the Greek word form, morphe, as demut, likeness, demuta, likeness, which also appears, of course, in the two texts from the Hebrew scriptures. God makes man in his Salem, image, and demut, likeness. And the key is the text from the two texts from Ezekiel, 1:26 and 28. He sees the throne in the beginning, borne by the living creatures, whom he later identifies as the cherubim in chapter 9. And then he looks to what they're carrying at the end, at the conclusion of the vision. And what they're carrying is a crystal in the shade of sapphire. And on the crystal is sapphire throne. And on the throne, and here are the key terms. One who appears in the Hebrew Kemari Demut Adam, in verse 26, in as it were the appearance of the likeness of a human being, and 128, Kemari Demut Kevod Adonai, as one who appears in the as the appearance of the likeness of the glory of God. So the key connection is the link between demut, likeness, and kavod, glory. And given that the author of Genesis, or the authors of Genesis 1, come from the same school as Ezekiel, he's a priest. It's held by many, certainly my lot, and I'm partial to this reading, of course, that demut and kavod are allied, that in fact what God does in Genesis 1:26 is make the human being in the likeness of the kavod, which, as one of my former students has argued in a paper, is part of his message. You don't need the temple anymore, and you certainly don't need any statues, because each one of you is a statue of God. Each one of you a representation of the glory of God. But there would be consequences to that connection later on that we see in the apocalyptic tradition that starts in the late Second Temple, or around 200 BC, and runs to, well, about 200 AD. And during this period, 400 years, several works appear, starting probably with First Enoch, the first part of First Enoch, the Book of the Watchers. Which features, in Enoch's case and in a number of other apocalypses, what John Collins, in a seminal edition of the journal Symeon, 1979, kind of rethinking of apocalyptic literature, identifies as the ascent to heaven. Enoch goes up, and he comes to the heavenly temple, and he sees the great glory on the throne, and is granted an archangelic function. He's to go preach to the angels who've fallen and telling them that there's no forgiveness, tell them there's no forgiveness. But the important note is the function, as well as the vision. And then, of course, one may think of the dream vision of Daniel, which is also featuring an ascent to heaven to see God on the throne. Actually, it's Ezekiel's throne, the chariot throne, the Merkabah. And of course, the passage in Revelations 4 and 5, where John the seer goes up and sees the throned figure and the Lamb. And of course, the angelic liturgy occurring round it. And to illustrate the importance of this notion for the Christian tradition, I will turn to Aphrahat, which will lead us into the matter of monasticism, or the New Testament monasticism. Now, as I noted earlier, Aphrahat is was not known until turn of the 20th century, when an obliging, I think it was a Jesuit, translated his 23 demonstrations into Latin. First translation since the Armenians did one back in the 5th or 6th century, into any other language than his native Syriac. He lived, as his sobriquet suggests, in the Persian Empire, probably in the region of what's now Iraqi Kurdistan. He wrote in 343, 344, and 345. We know those dates because he provides them. 23 demonstrations, 22 of which are sort of little treatises devoted to ascetic themes and ascetic problems. But the middle one, the 14th, is different. It's a kind of Catholic epistle directed to the Persian church as a whole. By the way, this is our first look at that church. Aphrahat is the first person by name that we know of from it. But it's clearly a going concern in the mid-4th century, with bishops and monasteries, and even a bishop claiming primacy that Aphrahat very much disapproves of. And the first half of it is a kind of Jeremiad, a listing of the sins and offenses of the Persian church. Also, of course, his whole entire work is a kind of revelation of a new form of asceticism that nobody had heard of before we come across him. And that is the phenomenon of, you could call it a kind of local version of monasticism, but it had nothing to do with the movement in Egypt occurring simultaneously. It was a native production. The ascetics were called Ichidai, which is a derivative of the word for one. But of significance, perhaps, is also the word that's used to translate the Greek monogenes in the Gospel of John. So the ascetic was understood to have a particular connection with God's only one, that is, the Son, who declared their intention to live an ascetic life, that is, a celibate life of prayer, at a church ceremony where they took a vow. This was the covenant, or keama. So they were known as the sons or daughters, the bnei or bat keama. And they've been around long enough in Aphrahat's day to have gone somewhat bad. So he addresses himself to correcting them as well. But he breaks off the Jeremiad about the middle of the discourse in order to take a breath, I suppose, but also turn to a positive example of the Christian life, and describes the perfected sage. And that's the passage that I want to bring to your attention. It begins with a citation from Job. Who has perceived the place of knowledge? Who has attained the roots of wisdom? Now, in Job, of course, the answer is nobody, but not Aphrahat. And who has discerned the place of understanding? Wisdom is hidden from all living things, from every fleshly thought, nor can the stupid purchase her with gold. Her treasure, though, is open and permitted to those who seek her out. Her light is greater than the sun, her radiance more comely than the moon. The innermost chambers of the intellect may touch her, and spiritual senses may attain to her, and fullness of mind may possess her. Whoever has opened the door of his heart finds her, and whoever unfolds the wings of his intellect possesses her. She dwells in the man who is diligent, and is implanted in the heart of the sage. In her he possesses a hidden treasure, and his thought flies to all the heights, and his pondering to all the depths. She inscribes wondrous things within his heart, and the eyes of his perceptions take in the bounds of the seas. All things created are enclosed within his thought, and his inclination thus to receive becomes yet more vast. He becomes the great temple of his creator. Indeed, the King of heaven enters and dwells in him, and lifts his intellect up to the heights, and causes the sage's thought to fly to his holy house, God's holy house, and makes manifest the treasures of everything that is within it. Now we come to the important bit, for our purposes anyway. His mind is absorbed in visions, his heart is wrapped in all its perceptions. A thing he never knew is shown him. He gazes on that place and contemplates it, and his mind is stupefied by everything it sees. All the watchers, the kind of heavenly deacons, hastening to his ministry, the seraphim chanting the thrice holy to his glory, flying swiftly with their wings, their vestments white and shining, hiding their face from his radiance, their courses swifter than the sun, than the wind. There is the throne of the kingdom established. There the judge makes ready the place of judgment. There the chairs of the righteous are set in order for them to judge the wicked on the day of judgment. Now here I'd like to pause, because there's an important little detail pointed out by Robert Murray about 30 years ago in a seminal article. That passage, all the watchers hastening to his ministry, the seraphim chanting the thrice holy to his glory, and veiling their faces from his radiance. The question is, who's the his? His ministry, his glory, his radiance, our natural thought, of course, as well. It's God. Right? That's the house where he is. That's what he's looking at. But no. After all, Syriac is a Semitic language, and Semitic languages have the peculiarity of attaching enclitics. In the case of each of those words, there's the third person masculine singular enclitic attached to it. And of course, the rules of grammar demand we attend to the nearest masculine antecedent. And the nearest masculine antecedent is the sage. So the angels are hastening to his ministry, veiling their faces from his glory, and chanting the thrice holy to him. In short, I know of no bolder statement of the doctrine of deification in patristic literature than this one. And he doesn't know the word. No one has ever caught him ever quoting a Greek patristic writer. He doesn't seem to have known them. He knows the Gospels, he knows and loves St. Paul, but he doesn't seem to have known anybody west of the border, whether contemporaneously or before. And this, mind you, he's saying, when the word theos has been around for what, not quite 200 years in the Greek East. I think Clement of Alexandria coined it. Someone can correct me, but I think it was Clement. And it's a Christian word because it doesn't appear that I'm aware of in pagan literature. They have apotheoses, but they don't have theoses. But Aphrahat's never heard of it. And it's almost exactly, and he's almost exactly contemporary with Athanasius. He is exactly contemporary. He was famous for God became man, that man might become God, yes. And of course, for his portrait of Antony in the Vita Antoni. And that wonderful chapter 14, which we have Antony emerging from his desert fatness, is actually, he didn't emerge, they broke down the door and pulled him out, as it were. Coming out of his desert fastness, neither excited nor depressed, neither too fat nor too thin, but altogether, as Athanasius says, natural, literally, entokataphysin. That is like Adam before the fall. And then, of course, immediately begins working miracles and the like. Greeted with the same amazement, Athanasius uses the same language, ethaumason, that we find in the Gospels regarding Christ's miracles, and it's deliberate, I'm sure, since for Athanasius, Antony is a kind of billboard for his theology and defense of the homoousion, as David Bracchi pointed out some time ago. So there you have a singularity. Two guys, you know, they're separated by two empires, two languages, no communication whatever. And you have this same picture of the divinized human, specifically the divinized ascetic. And so the question then arises, well, where does this come from? And since you can't connect the two, you have to triangulate. You can't go back to a common source in the Greek tradition because that doesn't apply to Aphrahat. And my answer is, you go back to Second Temple, to the pool of traditions out of which Christianity itself emerged. So Aphrahat. Now, the New Testament, of course, we have the Transfiguration narrative in the Synoptics. We have St. Paul in 2 Corinthians 12, speaking of his ascent to heaven, and it's uniformly regarded in the scriptures and in almost all New Testament scholars. There are a few hardheads who say no, but as Paul speaking in the third person of himself. 2 Corinthians 3, where Paul takes up Moses' shining face and then turns it into an advertisement for Christianity, saying, well, you know, that was true, but something's bigger now. You, Christians, we have something greater because it faded from Moses. But we're being transformed from glory to glory. And then in 2 Corinthians 4, he speaks of seeing the light of God in the face of Christ within the heart. To which I'd add, of course, John as a whole. This is the most cursory possible overlook. John as a whole. But let's take up the chapter that Symeon himself quotes many times John 17, where our Lord speaks of the glory he had with the Father before the world was made, and then in verse 5 and then verse 22, he speaks of having given this glory to his disciples. A verse which Symeon takes up in Ethical Discourse 112. Christ himself, he says, points out this very truth most clearly when he says, the glory which you have given me, I have given to them. Don't you see the glory the glory of God the Father, the glory of God the Father to the Son is given to the Son before the ages, is given by the Son himself to the saints, so that they may all be one. Then moving, and pretty briefly, since I've of course I'm running out of time, to the monastic literature of the 4th century. I won't trouble with anything beyond. We have the Vita that I spoke of, and of Antony. Then there are several episodes in the Apophthegmata with both recall the specific note of deification, the notes of Adam and the glory, and of heavenly ascent. Starting with the latter, there's a story about Abba Silvanus in the Apophthegmata. The Abba's disciple comes by the old man's place, his room, only to find him in a trance. He tries again several times over the next few hours with the same result, and finally, quote, he finds him at rest and says to him, "What happened to you today, Father?" The other said, "I was sick, child." But he, seizing the old man's feet, says, "I won't let you go till you tell me what you saw." The old man says to him, "I was caught up into heaven, and I saw the glory of God. And I was standing there until now, and now I've been sent away." And then a story about Abba Pambo. They used to say that just as Moses received the image of the glory of Adam when his countenance was glorified, so too with Abba Pambo, that his face shone like lightning, and he was as a king seated on his throne. And the same thing applied as well to Abba Silvanus and to Abba Sisois. The story of Sisois' death has this same note of, as alluded to, this same note of transfiguration and radiance. And of course, there's the story of Arsenius standing as a flame, as seen by one of the fathers of Skiti in the same Apophthegmata. To these witnesses, we might add, of course, Evagrius, who interiorizes the Sinai theophany in his schemata and speaks of the reception of the blessed light of the Holy Trinity, the Macarion Fos tis Agios Triados, and the Macarian homilies. Now, of course, they weren't by Macarius of Skiti, they were by some, to us, unknown ascetic from Roman Mesopotamia, the usual guess. They certainly seem to have come from Syria somewhere, or those bounds, because he knows that tradition, the writer. And in the best known collection of his works, the collection of 50 homilies, the very first one is an interiorization of the Merkavah of Ezekiel. He begins by rehearsing Ezekiel, the prophet's vision, and then says he really saw what he saw. It's real, theophany. But then he adds, but this is a mystery this is an indication of something even greater, of the soul of the human being becoming the throne of God. And then he proceeds to take the chayot, the living creatures, the cherubim, and make them indicators of the faculties of the intellect. So, as it were, he kind of marries Ezekiel and the Phaedrus. Together with assertions in the homilies of the reality of the vision of light. He's quite clear. He says, at one point in a collection which we don't have in English, the longer collection, collection number 1, that this light, which he claims to have seen in homily number 8 of the 50, in the form of a cross, is not a noema, that is something produced by the intellect. It's not a flash of insight, like the light bulb going on over a cartoon character's head in the old funnies. Rather, quote, it is a divine light shining essentially and substantially in ousia hypostasi in the hearts of the faithful, the divine and essential ousiodis light, which appears and shines in souls more than the light of the sun. And this is exactly the sort of language that we find Symeon using, hypostatikon, ousiodis, with respect to that, in many occasions, with respect to that same light. It's hard for me to think that Symeon didn't know the Macabean homilies, but I don't think anyone succeeded in nailing down any direct connection. But what does, I think, emerge as clear as a result of the examples that I've cited is that Symeon is indeed saying nothing new, if in a new way. That he is indeed repeating the tradition, exemplifying, in fact, being the tradition and of the scriptures and the fathers. In fact, he makes that point rather remarkably, underlines that point when he speaks of the holy person, the transfigured human, as indeed himself or herself, a kind of an equivalent to scripture. Doesn't need the scripture. Indeed, as the eschatological presence, even now. The day of the Lord, he says, dwells in them continuously.